The dog was already dying when Rowan Duff found her. He almost didn't stop. The highway between Kenora and Dryden was the kind of empty that makes a man feel like the last person left on earth, and the storm coming in from the northwest had turned the sky the color of a bruise. He'd been driving for 3 hours without the radio on, the way he always drove now, in silence, because silence was easier than the noise inside his own head. But the headlights caught something white in the ditch, and Rowan Duff, who had once waded into a burning building in Kandahar to pull out 2 men who were already past saving, could not make himself drive past a white shape in a ditch in November. He pulled over. She was a Siberian husky, or had been once. Now she was a wet, shaking thing curled around something he couldn't see at first, her ribs pushing hard against matted fur with every breath. She raised her head when he got close. Didn't run, didn't growl, just looked at him with eyes the color of a winter sky, one blue, one brown, and held absolutely still, the way animals do when they've stopped believing anything will get better but haven't yet given up on the small mercy of not being alone. He crouched down in the snow and looked at what she was protecting. 3 puppies, maybe 4 weeks old. 2 of them were moving. He stood up and looked at the highway. Both directions, nothing. The temperature was dropping fast. He could feel it through his jacket, through the scar tissue on the back of his left hand, where a piece of shrapnel the size of a thumbnail had done what it did. He looked back down at the dog. "All right," he said. He hadn't talked out loud in 4 days. His voice came out rougher than he expected. "All right." He had a moving blanket in the back of the truck. He used it. Rowan was 53 years old and had been living in the house outside Dryden for 2 years. Before that, there had been Halifax, where he and Joyce had spent 16 years in a house that was too big for 2 people, but exactly right for the family they'd planned on having. Before Halifax, there had been the Navy, and before the Navy there had been a version of himself he barely recognized anymore. A boy from Pictou County who'd wanted to see the world and had gotten considerably more of it than he'd bargained for. He'd served for 20 years. Most of that time was classified in ways he didn't discuss and thought about constantly. When he left the service, he had the handshake and the pension and the particular kind of quiet that follows a man home from certain places and never quite leaves. Joyce had understood more than he'd given her credit for. She'd had her own stillness, earned in ways different from his. She'd grown up with a father who drank, and a house where silence meant someone was about to get hurt, and she'd learned early how to move through a room without disturbing anything. When they first met at a kitchen party in Antigonish, she'd been the only person there who wasn't trying to fill the space. He'd noticed that before he noticed anything else about her. She died in February, 14 months before he found the dog. Pancreatic cancer, 3 months from diagnosis to the end, which the doctor had said was fast, and which Rowan had understood to mean merciful, though it had not felt that way. There'd been no time to prepare. One morning she was still making plans for spring. And then very suddenly it was March, and he was sitting in the driveway of the Halifax house with nowhere to go, and a lawyer telling him over the phone that he needed to start thinking about what he wanted to do with the property. He bought the place outside Dryden because he'd driven through it once in the 90s and remembered thinking it looked like the kind of town where a person could disappear without anyone taking it badly. He had not been wrong. He set the dogs up in the back porch with the moving blanket and a cardboard box and a space heater he dug out of the basement. The mother, he was already calling her that in his head, the mother, avoiding a name because names were a commitment he wasn't sure he was ready to make, lay down next to the box without being asked and began nursing the 2 living puppies immediately. The third he'd known was gone before they got off the highway. He'd buried it that night in the frozen ground at the edge of the property line, working by flashlight with a trenching spade, saying nothing out loud. The mother had a gash on her left shoulder, old enough to be infected. He cleaned it as best he could with the first aid kit in the bathroom, working slowly, talking to her in the low, even voice he'd once used to talk down frightened people in frightening situations. She allowed it. She kept her eyes on him the whole time, not threatening, just watchful, as though she needed to know exactly where he was at every moment. He understood that. The nearest vet was in Dryden. He called them when they opened at 8 in the morning and described what he had. They told him to bring her in. Both of them? He asked. He meant the puppies. All three, the receptionist said. Her name was Dr. Osi, and she was younger than he expected, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the particular manner of someone who'd chosen this work on purpose and still meant it. She looked at the mother's shoulder and said it was lucky he'd cleaned it when he did. She looked at the puppies and said they were underweight but would likely be fine with supplemental feeding for a few weeks. She looked at Rowan and said, "Are you keeping them?" "I found them," he said. "I know." She wrote something on a chart. "But are you keeping them?" He stood there in the fluorescent light of the examination room with his hands at his sides and looked at the mother lying on the steel table, her two puppies pressed against her flank, all three of them calm in the particular way that had come to mean something to him in the past 12 hours. The way they'd stopped bracing, the way the mother had let him carry her without fighting. "I'll come back for them Wednesday," he said. Dr. Osi wrote something else on the chart. She was smiling when she did it, though she kept it mostly to herself. He named them on the drive home. He hadn't planned to. It happened the way most things happened to him. Not as a decision, but as something that had already been decided by the time he noticed it. The mother, Coda. It had come to him in the waiting room, out of nowhere, the name of a place he'd been once briefly, under circumstances he didn't think about often. He'd liked the sound of it then, he liked it now. The first puppy, the one who'd been moving, Arrow. Because of the straight-ahead way she launched herself at anything within reach, all ambition and no caution, which struck him as a survival strategy he respected, even if he didn't share it anymore. The second puppy, the quiet one who watched before he moved, Bram. He pulled into the driveway and sat in the truck for a few minutes before going inside. He'd named them. That was a thing he'd done. The woman across the road was named Sylvain Ouellette, and she'd been watching him from her kitchen window for 2 years, the way people in small towns watch newcomers. Not unkindly, but carefully, the way you watch weather. She was 61 years old and had lived in the same house since she was 24. The year she and her husband Henri had moved up from Sault Ste. Marie. Because Henri had work in the forestry sector, and Sylvain had been young enough to follow a man to the middle of nowhere and believe it was an adventure. It had turned out to be both things. An adventure and the middle of nowhere, and she'd made a life she was genuinely fond of, one that had narrowed significantly when Henri had his stroke 6 winters ago and narrowed further when he passed 2 years after that. She was not a woman who felt sorry for herself. Her daughters called every Sunday. She had a kitchen garden in the summer and a book club in the winter, and a particular way of moving through her own house that suggested she'd made her peace with it. But the winters here were long, and the nearest town was 20 minutes. And some mornings the silence pressed against the windows, like something trying to get in. She'd seen him pull up with the dogs. She'd watched from across the road, far enough away to pretend she wasn't watching, as he carried the mother in from the truck, careful and deliberate, the puppies in the blanket under his other arm. She brought soup over the next afternoon. This was not unusual in Dryden. She'd been the recipient of enough soup in her own hard seasons to understand it as the language it was. "I see you. I'm not going to make a big thing of it. Here is something warm." He opened the door and looked at her for a moment, as if he was trying to remember how this was supposed to go. "Sylvain Ouellette," she said. "From across the road I heard about the dogs, how—" "This is Dryden," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He stepped back from the door. She stayed 40 minutes. She met Coda, who sniffed her boot and then went back to the puppies with the particular dismissiveness of an animal who has recently been through enough and is not taking social calls at this time. She met Arrow, who launched herself at Sylvain's knee with total conviction. She met Bram, who sat at a distance and watched the whole interaction with an expression Sylvain found deeply relatable. "He thinks everything over before he does it," Rowan said. "Smart dog, or scared one. Sometimes that's the same thing," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Bram. "He's getting better," he said. "Faster than I expected." She let that sit for a moment before she asked if he wanted more soup, which was also in its way a different question. "I'm all right," he said, "thank you. For this." He meant the soup. He might have meant the visit. He wasn't entirely sure. She left her phone number on the counter without saying anything about it. He didn't mention it either. The first month was harder than he'd anticipated, not because the dogs were difficult, but because they weren't. Coda settled into the back porch, and then into the kitchen, and then into the habit of lying under his chair while he had his morning coffee, which was an unremarkable thing, and also the first unremarkable thing that had happened to him in a long time. Arrow destroyed 1 boot, 3 dish towels, and a paperback copy of a Farley Mowat book he'd been meaning to read for 30 years. Bram learned to come to him, slowly, cautiously, the way he did everything, and then one evening simply jumped up onto the couch next to him without ceremony and lay down against his leg, and Rowan sat very still for a long time because he didn't want to disrupt it. Joyce would have laughed at him. That was the thing about grief he'd come to understand. It didn't sit still. It moved around inside you, and sometimes it came up at unexpected angles. He'd be doing something ordinary, rinsing a bowl or lacing a boot, and suddenly he'd be thinking about the specific sound of her laugh, which had been loud and unself-conscious in a way that still surprised him when he remembered it. Because she'd been so quiet in most other ways. She'd have had names for the dogs before they were in the door. He thought about that. About the 43 months he'd lost before she got the diagnosis, when he'd been too inside his own head to be the husband he'd meant to be. He was a man who'd been trained to manage threat assessments and exfiltration routes. But he had never been particularly good at the ordinary domestic act of being present for someone who needed him to show up in small ways rather than large ones. The Navy had given him a set of skills that were precise and specific and largely useless in a kitchen in Halifax. He'd been better at the end. That was something. He didn't know if it was enough. Coda put her head on his knee one morning while he was sitting at the kitchen table not drinking his coffee, and he put his hand on her head and said, out loud to no one in particular, "Yeah." Sylvain came back the following Thursday with butter tarts, which she announced up front to distinguish this visit from soup, which had been emergency hospitality, whereas butter tarts were recreational. "That's a distinction I've never heard before," he said. "It's the North," she said. "We have a lot of time to think about these things." She sat at the kitchen table, and he made tea, and Coda regarded her from across the room with the same evaluating look she gave most things. Not hostile, just thorough. Arrow attempted to steal a butter tart. Bram sat under the table near Sylvain's chair, which was the closest he'd gotten to a visitor since the vet. "He likes you," Rowan said. "I have a calming presence," she said. "My daughters say it makes me boring at parties." He did smile then, properly, for the first time she'd seen. It changed his face significantly. She told him about Dryden, about the winters and the ice road north of town, and the summer when the lake behind her property had turned completely clear for 3 weeks, and she'd been able to see all the way to the bottom, which had felt like a secret. She talked about Henri in the matter-of-fact way of someone who has processed a loss long enough to carry it without wincing. Still heavy, still present, but no longer sharp at every edge. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without performance. "You were in the military," she said. "It wasn't a question. Navy, 20 years, my nephew was in the army, 2 tours in Afghanistan." She paused. "He's okay, better than he was. It took a while." Rowan turned his mug in his hands. "It takes a while. He has a dog now too," she said. "Ridiculous animal, enormous. Some kind of mastiff." She looked at Arrow, who was now attempting to steal Bram's section of the blanket. "They helped him. I don't know how to explain it except that they did." "You don't have to explain it," he said. She looked at him. "No," she said quietly. "I don't suppose you do." December came in hard, the kind of cold that settles over the boreal and stays, insistent and absolute, so that after a while you stopped thinking of the warmth as normal and began to understand the cold as the baseline against which everything else measured itself. He got into a routine. Morning coffee with Coda under the chair, feeding the puppies, who were growing with an urgency that seemed almost aggressive. Long walks in the afternoon, the 4 of them moving through the snow in the pine stand behind the property. Coda close to his side, Arrow ranging out and doubling back, Bram moving steadily a few paces behind. He'd started sleeping better. He noticed it the way he noticed the dogs learning their names. Quietly, without announcement, the way important things often happened. He called his sister in Pictou on a Sunday evening, the first call he'd made in 3 months. Her name was Erin, and she'd been leaving voicemails in a patient, measured way that told him she'd talk to someone about how to handle him, which he found both touching and faintly mortifying. "You sound different," she said. "I got dogs." A pause. "How many?" "3, Rowan. It wasn't planned." She laughed. He'd forgotten the specific texture of his sister's laugh, which was completely different from Joyce's. Lower, a little dry, and hearing it did something to his chest he couldn't have named exactly, but recognized as something moving that had been stuck. He told her about Coda and the highway and the November storm. He told her about Arrow and the Farley Mowat book. He told her about Bram getting on the couch. He talked for longer than he'd talked to anyone since the lawyer in the driveway, and by the end of it his voice had lost the roughness. "Come for Christmas," Erin said. "Maybe," he said. She knew him well enough not to push. He did not go for Christmas, but he called, and the call lasted 2 hours, and he sat on the floor during most of it with Coda's head in his lap, and Arrow asleep against his left side, and Bram pressed carefully against his right. And at one point Erin heard one of the puppies making the particular sound puppies make when they want something, and she said, "Was that a dog?" And he said yes, and she said, "I want to meet them." And he said, "Come in the spring," which was the first invitation he'd extended to anyone in 14 months. Sylvain brought him a jar of her homemade cranberry preserves on Christmas Eve, and he gave her a bag of the good ground coffee he'd driven into town for, and they stood in his doorway for a moment in the light from inside, the cold at their backs, and she said, "Merry Christmas, Rowan." And he said, "Merry Christmas, Sylvain." And it was the most uncomplicated exchange he'd had with another person in as long as he could remember. After she left, he stood at the kitchen window and watched the snow come down on the tree line and thought about Joyce, who had loved Christmas in the particular way of someone who'd had too few good ones growing up, and never quite got over the wonder of a good one. He thought about the way she'd made the house smell like pine and orange peel every December. He thought about the January she'd tried to teach him to skate, and he'd been terrible at it, and she'd laughed and taken his arm and said it was fine. She'd rather hold on to him anyway. He'd been so afraid of the grief that he'd kept it at a distance for months, holding it at arm's length, not looking directly at it, which was a thing he understood from his Navy training, that certain things could not be looked at directly, that sometimes you had to use peripheral vision. But grief, he was learning, was not the same as a threat. Grief was not trying to hurt him, it was just trying to find somewhere to go. Coda came and sat next to him at the window. He put his hand on her back. She was warm. "She would have loved you," he said. "All 3 of you. She'd have had you on the furniture by day 1. He looked out at the snow. "I'm trying," he said. He wasn't sure who he was saying it to. He thought maybe that didn't matter. January, February. The long stalls of a northern winter, the light coming back in increments so small they were almost theoretical. Arrow reached her full growth at 6 months. Not large, but dense, a compact intensity that expressed itself in everything she did. She learned to sit, to stay, to come, to leave the dish towels alone mostly. She learned that Bram liked to sleep near the heater, and that Coda's space under Rowan's chair was not negotiable. She established her own territory on the 3rd stair from the bottom of the staircase, where she spent her evenings with an air of someone overseeing operations from a command post. Bram learned things more slowly and held them longer. He learned to trust in the particular way of an animal who had reason not to, which meant first, he learned that Rowan would not raise his voice, and then he learned that the food would come at the same time every day, and then he learned that the touch on his head before bed was a thing that happened every night without exception. Each thing built on the last. Each thing was earned. Rowan watched him work through it and said nothing. He understood the architecture of it. He understood that you couldn't rush the sequence, that you had to wait for each thing to settle before the next could be placed on top of it. It was structural. It was patient work. He'd done structural, patient work before. He was not without those skills. In March he took Bram off-leash for the first time in the pine stand behind the property, because Bram had reached the point where he knew where home was and would come back to it. He stood in the snow and watched the dog move through the trees. Still careful, still deliberate, but moving, covering ground, lifting his nose to the cold air with something that looked very much like curiosity. Sylvain had come along for the walk. She stood next to him and watched Bram range out and circle back. "He's come a long way," she said. "He has," Rowan said. She pulled her scarf up against the wind. The light was different now than it had been in November, thinner maybe, but longer, the way February light in the north is more a promise than a delivery. "How about you?" He looked at her. She was looking at the tree line, giving him the same privacy she always gave him. He appreciated that about her. She had never asked him anything head-on. She left the doors open and let him decide whether to walk through them. "Better," he said. "Better than I expected." She nodded. They stood there a while in the pine smell and the cold, watching the 3 dogs move through the snow. "Henry used to say winter was the honest season," she said eventually, "because there's nowhere to hide. Everything's stripped back. You can see what's actually there." He thought about that, about what it meant to stop hiding from what was actually there. "He sounds like he was a smart man," Rowan said. "He was. Profoundly annoying." She smiled. "I miss him every day." Bram came back and sat at his feet, leaning lightly against his leg, and Rowan put his hand on the dog's head the way he did every night before bed, the gesture so familiar now it happened before he thought about it. Erin came in May. She stood in his driveway with her overnight bag and looked at her brother. The gray in his hair, the way he stood differently than he used to, less braced, more settled, and she said, "You look like yourself." He took her bag. "I look old." "Same thing," she said. Arrow met her at the door with complete commitment. Coda assessed her and found her adequate. Bram observed from the bottom stair, and then, by the second morning, was following Erin from room to room, with the dedicated attention of someone who has determined that this person can be trusted, and intends to make the most of the visit. She sat at his kitchen table the first evening and said, "Tell me about her." He poured them both a glass of wine and sat down and told her about Joyce. Not the careful abbreviated version he'd been giving people, the diagnosis, the months, the end, the real version. The kitchen party in Antigonish, the way she'd taken his arm on the ice. The January she'd decided they should learn to make bread, and they'd both been terrible at it, and had laughed themselves hoarse in the kitchen, at 2 in the morning, with flour on everything. The particular quality of her silences, which had always meant she was somewhere deep inside a thought and would come back to him when she surfaced. The house that had been too big for 2 people, the plans for spring. He talked for a long time. Erin listened the way she'd always listened, like she had nowhere else to be and no other purpose. The dogs settled around them, Coda on the floor under the table, Arrow on the stair post. Bram up on the couch now, a habit that had started in February and become, without discussion, simply the way things were. When he was finished, Erin reached across the table and put her hand over his. She would have liked it here, she said. He looked around the kitchen. At the wood stove and the window over the sink, and the pine trees visible through the glass, still holding their new green. "I think so," he said. In June, Rowan Duff built a covered run off the back porch, so the dogs could be outside in the rain without getting soaked, which was a thing that had bothered him since January, and which he addressed with the methodical attention he brought to practical problems, measuring twice and cutting once the way his grandfather had taught him. He had the radio on while he worked, a country station out of Kenora. He didn't usually have music on, but Erin had put it on before she left and he hadn't turned it off. Sylvain came by in the afternoon and looked at his work. "Solid," she said. "It'll hold," he said. She stood there with her hands in her jacket pockets, looking at the structure and then at him. "I was thinking," she said. "My nephew is coming up next month, the one I mentioned, the one with the mastiff." "Yes," I thought. She paused. "I don't know if you'd be interested in meeting him. For dinner, maybe. Nothing formal. He talks a lot so you wouldn't have to." He set down the hammer, looked at the covered run, then at her. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." She nodded, satisfied, and went back across the road, and Rowan turned the radio up a little and went back to work, and after a while Arrow came out through the door and sat beside him in her command post way, watching him with complete attention, as if she were supervising. "I know," he said to her. "Don't rush me." She wagged once, very dignified. At the end of August, when the light had turned that particular northern gold that meant the summer was winding down and didn't feel sorry about it, Rowan Duff drove back out to the stretch of highway between Kenora and Dryden. He wasn't sure why, exactly. He'd thought about it a few times and not been able to articulate the reason in terms that satisfied him. He'd done things in the Navy that he'd had no explanation for at the time and had understood only later. He trusted the impulse. He pulled over at approximately the right spot. The ditch was green now, tall grass and fireweed, no trace of November. He stood at the side of the road with Coda next to him, and the truck idling behind them, and looked at where the world had been white and closed and cold, and thought about the moment he'd seen the shape in the ditch. He thought about Joyce, and about Bram learning to trust in sequence, and about the way Aaron had said you look like yourself, and about Sylvain standing in the snow saying Henri believed winter was the honest season. He thought about the fact that he had, without quite deciding to, built something. Not large, not dramatic, a covered run and a morning routine and a jar of cranberry preserves on a kitchen counter. A phone call to Pictou County. An invitation for spring extended and kept. He thought about the third puppy, buried at the property line in the dark. He thought about the things you carry, and the things you set down, and the fact that sometimes you couldn't tell the difference until one of them was already gone. Coda sat down next to his boot and leaned against him. The fireweed moved in the wind off the highway. Somewhere in the grass, a red-winged blackbird was making its opinion known. He bent down and put both hands on Coda's face and looked at her. The mismatched eyes, the scar on her shoulder, the steadiness that had been there from the very first night, in the snow, when she'd raised her head and looked at him and held still. She looked back at him the same way she always had, as if she'd known exactly what she was doing when she decided to stay. He stood up. He walked back to the truck. He drove home.